Let's pray. Lord, grant us your spirit as we consider the things that pertain to our salvation. For we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So happy Sabbath, everyone. So the title for today's study is The Agitation of the Sunday Law, an examination of important legislation. Right. So basically what we'll be doing is, of course, we understand that we are presently in this dispensation. We are in the, I guess what's called the agitation of the Sunday law. We're in that critical lead up to the Sunday law waymark, where we're seeing all the subjects that are going to be the testing issues within the Sunday law crisis. We're seeing them all being brought to the forefront of, I guess, social discourse, of political discourse in different ways. The debate is being brought to the forefront of people's minds, and we're seeing a lot of legislation being passed in different countries around the world, but certainly in the United States. And today we're going to focus on the United States specifically. Legislation which is, really is a precursors to the Sunday law and leading up to the Sunday law. So we want to take a look at some of this legislation. We're going to be going through a number of news items, right? And some of these things you may be aware of, that they're going on right now, and some of them may be new to you. But in any case, and again, I invite your participation. Feel free to open your mic and interject, because I'm looking at my notes. I don't necessarily have the Zoom screen in front of me, so I can't see. I'll flip back to check the chat to see if anyone's contributing there. But yeah, please feel free to interject. So again, for a bit of context, this is the same line that we had the last time I shared. Externally, where do we stand? We stand in a pre-Sunday law history where the Sunday law issue or issues are being agitated. And what is being agitated or shaken is a story, essentially, something that is happening in society. And as Ellen White frames it, as she speaks of this period of agitation, it is a prediction, it's a foretelling of what is coming in the future in a much more serious, severe way, if I may put it that way. So what is being agitated? I guess there are a number of ways we could frame it. But the way I'm choosing to frame it is where all these issues in the culture wars, in the political battles that are being waged in the legislatures of various countries, particularly the United States, what it boils down to fundamentally, where it's leading, is the subversion of democracy and the entrenching of patriarchal oppression, right? And it's within that context that gender equality really becomes a test, really becomes a counter message to the prevailing currents and a testing issue in our time period. Alda Parminder shared a study a few years ago on degrees of inspiration. You may remember that he's spoken on it variously. And the conclusion of that study is that there are two types of prophets, essentially. The first type is us, right? This movement, the Stone of Daniel 2, or the 144,000. The second group of prophets are journalists, those who present the news, present what is happening in front of them, right? Present what is happening in the world. And we are agitating these subjects through a prophetic lens within the context of this movement. But the agitation in the public sphere, because we know that the world, even the Levites and the Nephilim, are not developed by us primarily, right? It is the other prophets that they're listening to, and it's the other prophets that are that have been giving them the messages that are developing them there early and latter rain. So these external events that the journalists are presenting, not only for our benefit, but for the world, they are a window into the Sunday law crisis, right? And when we look at these external events, we can identify flashpoints, right? Flashpoints which capture the news cycle, right? Which are almost impossible to ignore, such as the repealing of the striking down of Roe v. Wade. So there are flashpoints like that, but a lot of the very damaging legislation, a lot of the progressive creep towards the Sunday law is not captured, is not captured in these flashpoints in the news cycle. It's happening not at the national level, so much as it is happening at the state level. And, generally speaking, we're not paying as much attention, and the news cycle is not paying as, I don't say not paying as much attention, but there isn't as much focus on what is happening at the state level. It does not it does not capture as much attention, but that is where a lot of the, as I said, some of the most damaging, legislation is being considered and being passed, and it's really at that state level that you can track the creep of, increasingly oppressive state power. I made a point in my notes that it is somewhat similar to the fulfillment of the Battle of Raphia. If you recall, I believe definitely when I was in Uganda, shortly before the pandemic, I did give a presentation on the fulfillment of the Battle of Raphia. And that I felt that presentation was necessary to track all the prophetic identifications we have made and to connect them to their fulfillment in real life, and to.
Excuse me, Elder Tuck.
Yes.
There are people waiting to get in.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that, Annabelle. I'll continue to keep an eye on that. Thank you. Okay, my apologies to those who are waiting to get in. So when you look at the fulfillment of the Battle of Raphia, there were people who were opposing the message at the time, who presented the idea that, well, where's Raphia? Nothing spectacular happened. All those predictions have come to naught. But what we've seen, and it's a recurring issue throughout the history of this movement, and it comes into, it becomes especially important now, is that when it comes to the fulfillment of prophecy, you have to know what you're looking for. You have to know what the fulfillment of prophecy looks like. Right, you have to be paying attention to the progressive developments that represent the fulfillment of prophecy, because the fulfillments aren't always a single spectacular event, but the fulfillments are often progressive developments. And to track that progression, you have to be paying attention, right? Yeah, so I guess in connection with that, we want to look at the developments that have been taking place in various states in the United States that touch on the issue of equality, on gender equality, and the broader issues surrounding gender equality, LGBTQ rights, and so on. But before we begin our review of some of the legislation, I just wanted to bring us back. You may remember, I think it must have been 2019 now, when we're talking about Project Blitz, and how Project Blitz, it was a Dominionist organization founded in 2016. It was part of the Christian right, and its purpose was to, reading quote, a quote, to protect the free exercise of traditional Judeo-Christian religious values and beliefs in the public square, and to reclaim and properly define the narrative which supports such beliefs. Right? And how did they go about this? Do you remember? They would frame model legislation that they would, like templates for legislation forwarding various objectives that they had. Those objectives were, promoting religion in schools, for example, anti-LGBTQ legislation, and they would give this model legislation to conservative legislators, conservative politicians, to then propose in their respective state legislatures, right? And part of their strategy was, and it's in the name Blitz, to inundate the legislative space with their material, almost in a way to keep those who oppose them constantly on the defensive, playing whack-a-mole. I don't know if you know that game, whack-a-mole, right? It's to just inundate the space with their ideas, right? To almost make it hard to know where to focus because there's just so much of it, right? And that is what we're seeing now is reminiscent of. That is what it looks like. It looks like the Project Blitz playbook, except to a much greater extent than anything that we've seen up to this point. And it's effective. It's working. It's working. So you may remember a few weeks ago, Jonathan was here, and he shared a website from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and that's a very good website to take a look at, because it's tracking the legislation. It's currently tracking 435 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation that are being proposed, that have been passed, or that are in the process of debate right now. As of today, there are 435 pieces of legislation, anti-LGBTQ legislation, that Republicans are trying to push forward at different levels. And the website, well, firstly, I think today what I'd like us to go through is anti-LGBTQ legislation, because that's one prong, a very visible prong of the right-wing strategy that we're seeing at play today, even in the culture wars, in the news cycle. It's, there's all this sort of hyped up talk about, trans people. Trans people are the issue right now in public discourse, and what their rights are and what their rights aren't are, and framing them as predatory and as dangerous, and forwarding legislation to suppress them, right? That of course touches on equality, and then there's anti-abortion legislation that I want us to look at. I want us to look at as well, sort of see where things are with that, because there's a lot happening at the state level on that front as well, which is having real life impacts to to people, to women on the ground, right? Roe v. Wade was the flashpoint, but there's a lot happening, which is constitution that creep towards the Sunday law, towards entrenched patriarchal oppression. Okay. I hope that is all clear so far. So when you go to that website, aclu.org, and you go to the page on legislative attacks on LGBTQ rights, what we're seeing is the legislation, these 435 and counting pieces of legislation that have been tabled, that have been proposed. They fall under various categories. You can put them in various categories in terms of what they are trying to do, in terms of the way that they're trying to target, in terms of the part of the people's lives that they're trying to target and suppress, right? And I just thought I'd take a moment to go through these, to sort of go through the areas where, to go through the various categories that these bills fall under. I think I'll leave it to you to go to the website and look at explore those bills, because they're there, right? For our purposes today, I just want to do like a high level overview that, these are the various areas that this legislation is targeting. And the first is accurate IDs. Accurate IDs. So having to turn over your license to the police can be stressful for anyone, but that stress can be amplified for transgender people. Every time you show an ID that fails to match your gender to a store clerk, a security guard, or TSA agent, it can be a constant reminder that the government doesn't recognize your gender. Many states require you to jump through a complicated set of hoops to correct your ID, if you're even allowed to make changes to it at all. And the ACLU says it's working to lessen or get rid of these hurdles that transgender people face in securing identity documents with their name and gender, which have their gender accurately reflected. So these anti-trans bills targeting identification documentation, they attempt to limit the ability to update gender information on IDs and records such as birth certificates and driver's licenses and so on. And this puts transgender people at risk of losing jobs, of facing harassment and being harmed in other ways. Trans, intersex, and non-binary people need IDs that accurately reflect who they are in order to travel, in order to apply for jobs and enter public establishments without the risk of harassment or harm. Right. So that very basic human necessity, they need to have accurate identification documentation, which can complicate your life, you know, in serious and unforeseen ways. If you don't have it, or if you don't have it properly representing who you are, that is one of the prongs, that is one of the targets, that's one of the ways in which the swarm of legislation is targeting and suppressing people from the trans community. Another focus of the legislative attacks is civil rights. So with increasing frequency, what we've been seeing is individuals and institutions claiming a right to discriminate by refusing services to women and people from the LGBTQ community based on religious objections, right? And we've discussed this a lot. Elder Tess has definitely spoken about it, where there is a shifting of the goalposts that is taking place, that the dominionists have been subtly but effectively promoting, where freedom of religion is not simply the right to believe what you want to believe. It's not simply the right to believe what you want to believe within your own self and practice within the limits of your sphere of action, your religion, right? They're extending the notion of religious freedom to include the right to discriminate against others on the basis of your personally held religious beliefs, regardless of whether they share those religious beliefs or not. Freedom of religion now means that, you know, if I don't believe in birth control, right? And if I own a pharmacy, I can turn away women who are seeking to fill birth control prescriptions, right? You are imposing your religious belief on that person in a way that is suppressing them, that is oppressing them. Or if you own a bridal salon or a photo studio or a reception hall, and you decide to close your doors to same-sex couples, you know, who want to have a function or a wedding, because of your beliefs, right? They are not, you are imposing your religious beliefs on them in a way that is oppressing them, right? You're seeing religiously affiliated schools firing women because they became pregnant while not married, right? And you have a lot of these schools, you know, being funded by the state, but are being funded by the state and should be accountable to the state to act in a way that is, you know, that recognizes the separation of church and state, if I may put it that way. But you do see these things, right? You see business owners refusing to provide insurance coverage for contraception for their employees. You see graduate students training to be social workers, refusing to counsel gay people, right? And I want us to see that the ID issue is one thing. It may affect you, but it won't. It may place unfair hurdles in your life, but it won't. It may not stop you or prevent you from being able to go on with your life, right? It may impose unfair hurdles, and it can make life more dangerous for you. But say, you can get on with it. You can, but then you add the civil rights issue. Then it's affecting you in other additional ways. Then you add the other issues that we're going to cover cumulatively in terms of the impact that these issues, that all these oppressive enactments are going to have on your life. Cumulatively, it becomes grinding, it becomes crushing. It's like there then becomes no element, no aspect, no arena of your life that is unaffected by it, right? And all of it is communicating, emphasizing the idea that you are a second-class citizen and you don't have the same rights as everyone else, right? So, there's the cumulative effect when you think of how all these things would affect someone. The ACLU's notes on this section does make the point I just made, which is that religious freedom in America means that we all have a right to our religious beliefs, but this does not give us the right to use our religion to discriminate against and impose those beliefs on others who do not share them. Right. So when you look at the anti-LGBTQ bills that are being passed that touch on civil rights, they are attempting to undermine and weaken non-discrimination laws by allowing employers, businesses, and even hospitals to turn away LGBTQ people or refuse them equal treatment. All right, so the next column that that this swarm of legislation falls under is targeting free speech and expression. So despite the safeguards of the First Amendment's right to free expression, politicians are fighting to restrict how and when LGBTQ people can be themselves, limiting access to books about them, and trying to ban or censor performances like drag shows. If you've been following the news cycle, even here in Canada, drag shows are the latest whipping horse of right-wing conservative media, right? And it's always framed as this is being done to protect children, right?
Elder Tipo.
Yes.
Forgive me to interrupt. Is Annabelle waiting to get in? She went out, but she's trying to get back in and isn't able.
I just let them in.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so I'm looking at the chat. Carlton, you asked me to repeat. What would you like me to repeat?
It was a part about where you were talking about.
Sorry, you're very faint.
Sorry, the religious belief imposing on others. You were given an example of being a pharmacy at a pharmaceutical, and somebody who's who wants to have abortion comes to to buy, abortion pills, and you don't give it to them. So I'm thinking, my question was like, if he's not religious, I'm trying to figure out how he's imposing on that person.
Well, that's what's been happening. Say I'm a woman. I'm not. I don't believe abortion is a sin, and you're a pharmacist behind the counter, and you believe abortion's wrong. And because I believe abortion's wrong, it is legal, right? People have a right to abortion, or at least should. And then because I feel it is wrong, I refuse to provide you with a public legal service, a legal service, right? That is available to the public. I'm limiting your access to something you have a right to, but I don't believe it's right. Right. It's the same thing with the right, the stories about gay couples looking for wedding cakes to be baked for them, and then the bakery says, I don't believe in I don't believe in gay marriage, so I'm not going to bake the cake. You're offering a service to the public, and you're going to deny that service to to a person because you don't agree because of your religious beliefs about their lives, right? It's always interesting with that one because I guess I had the thought, so if they found out that someone is an adulterer, that they've cheated on their spouse or something like that, would they refuse to bake the cake? If they found out that someone, was a thief at some odd time, whatever the case may be, would they refuse to bake the cake? Generally, no. They don't make that their business. They don't make, such questions their business about a person's life. It's a business transaction, a business transaction offered to the public, right? But on this issue, they treat it differently, right? So, yeah. Anyway, yeah. So they're definitely. You just need to Google. These are things that there are always new instances popping up, and they get taken to court, or they make the news, and so on and so forth. So these are things that are happening. So we're talking about free speech and expression. Right, we've seen how trans people are the latest whipping horse of the right-wing media, framing transgender people as predatory, framing their drag shows as scenes where children are groomed in inappropriate ways, and all this is it's playing out in the culture wars. All this is angling towards right, fomenting hatred against them. Right, it's the latest issue that is uniting the right, and galvanizing them to action. So,
could I comment?
Yes, go ahead.
Could I just comment on that remark? Religious right, yes, being galvanized on the issue regarding LGBTQ, but it should also be noted that in terms of the spectrum of gender orientation, a lot of gay people are rising up against trans people. And I mean, it was there before, in previous years, but it's really starting, and I'll use your word, it's really starting to galvanize a lot of homosexuals and binary people are rising up to bring forth a narrative. The TQ part they want to cut off. LGB, lesbians, gays, homosexual men, and binary, both sexes. It's fine. But in essence, what they're arguing is very similarly to the religious right. It's simply binary. Male, female, and those who like both. And they're wanting to truncate trans people because they believe as well, and I'm not saying this is all gay people, but there's a segment within the, I'll call it the gay movement, homosexual movement, that is wanting to distance themselves from transgender people. And so what Elder Tess had said is there is a lot of animosity by homosexuals against transgender individuals. And so they're, in essence, supporting the same narrative that the religious right is, coming from a little different perspective, perhaps. I just wanted to note that.
And yes, I've definitely observed, the gay people who are also adopting the right-wing talking points and narratives about trans people. And it's also feminists, people who present themselves as feminists, who've been very vocal and prominent in terms of forwarding the narrative that trans women aren't women, and we ought to protect real women's spaces from trans women. There's also a segment of purported feminists who are taking up the same line. I think
Yes.
one prominent one is, yes.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to agree. And feminists that are not necessarily, well, they definitely aren't radical feminists. They're liberal feminists. They want to retain femininity. They see nothing wrong with it. And they don't like any kind of quote unquote anti-men kind of insinuation. I mean, it's a wrong interpretation of radical feminism. But yes, it's feminists, but in name only. They're not the radical feminists. So go ahead with your example. Forgive me, you were going to suggest somebody by name.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. No, I was done. So we've talked about accurate ID, civil rights, and free speech. When we look at how this anti-LGBTQ legislation is at the various categories that this anti-LGBTQ legislation is falling under. So we're still talking about free speech. Towards the end of 2022, lawmakers in 6 states proposed bills to ban drag in public or in the presence of minors. amidst this wave of anti-drag legislation and violence, drag performers and host venues across the country are moving to higher security or cancel performances altogether. So yes, we're seeing in the culture wars and legislation, the suppression of free speech, the pathologizing of trans people, right? As you know, in tandem with the legislation suppressing their freedom of speech and expression. Going to talk about healthcare briefly. I'm gonna try and move a little quicker because I do want to make time for anti-abortion. So when it comes to healthcare, these bills are targeting medically necessary healthcare like Medicaid for transgender people. Many of these bills ban affirming care for trans youth and can create criminal penalties for providing this care. These bills exempt identical treatments offered to cisgender youth, or I'll read that again. These bills exempt identical treatments offered to cisgender youth or are forced onto intersex youth. Other bills block funding to medical centers that offer gender-affirming care or block insurance coverage of healthcare for transgender people. Right, so I'll go on to public accommodations. When it comes to public accommodations, the bills that we're seeing in this vein seek to prohibit transgender people from using facilities like public bathrooms and locker rooms. And everyone should have access to these spaces, no matter what their gender identity or gender expression. And if you can't use something as basic as a restroom, you can't fully participate in work, in school, and in public life. In Tennessee in particular, if the social conservatives there get their way, the state will soon become the second in the nation to use the coercive power of the government to force people into bathrooms that violate their sense of self, or risk punishment if they went with the bathrooms that are aligned with who they are. Legislation targeting trans students is pending in both houses in Tennessee's legislature, and it would require public schools and university students to use a bathroom or locker room that matches the sex recorded on their birth certificate. And you know, there's the point about how there is the right-wing ethos of limited government. And we've spoken about that a lot, but we see that, you know, this is not limited government. You know, this is not limited government at all. Their notions of freedom and limited government, you know, seem to really reflect the desire to want to be free to discriminate, right? And their conception of government is very active and interventionist and activist when it comes to oppressing people who do not form, people who are different, right? People who are, you know, not white males, basically. North Carolina passed an even broader law in March. And at least 30 similar bills have been introduced in a total of 16 states this year alone. So proponents of these discriminatory anti-trans bathroom bills they've advanced many arguments for why they're necessary. and they're usually based on urban legends. Some argue that these bills are necessary to stop predatory men from dressing up as women, entering the female restroom, and then attacking unsuspecting women. The more restrained version of this one says it will stop men from just trying to sneak a peek. So, not surprisingly, these are, the saying goes, solutions in search of a problem, right? Because, the problem that they are seeking to address does not exist. There is neither evidence that anyone has used the transgender defense for illegal conduct, nor reports of any increase in public safety incidents in any of the hundreds of jurisdictions that have extended legal protections to transgender people. It's not an issue. Even here in Canada, I've seen news articles, and when you go read the news, then you read the comments. This is often an argument that, men will be able to claim to be a woman and go into women's bathrooms and cause all manner of havoc. It's a hypothetical that has been effective in terms of fear mongering, but statistically speaking, that's not happening, right? It's not what's taking place. And the next point here, that transgender people, whether we know it or not, are already using the bathrooms that they have a right to, and doing so without incident. In fact, hundreds of localities and school districts across the country have created more welcoming environments for all, including transgender people. And mayors and law enforcement leaders and others have said non-discrimination protections actually make their cities safer, right? Even here in Canada, transgender people are already, right, using the bathrooms that align with their identity, right? And it has not been an issue where we're seeing predatory behavior, we're seeing pathological behavior, that we're seeing problems emerging from this. It hasn't been an issue, but it's being drummed up to be an issue now, because it's being drummed up to be an issue now in the culture wars, because there's a political agenda, right, that is being served by it. So it makes the point that laws like North Carolina's and bills like Tennessee's, if enacted, mean transgender people will have to make the impossible decision of breaking the law or revealing their private medical information. Not to mention the obvious risk of harassment and violence that comes with forcing transgender women into men's restrooms and transgender men into women's restrooms. The fear of violence is already a daily reality for transgender people, and bills like these could very well make it unsafe for trans people to go out in public if they become law. Okay, so I have more on my notes on that, but I'll move on to schools and education. Then after this, we'll go on to what's going on in the area of anti-abortion. So when it comes to schools and education, state lawmakers are trying to prevent trans students from participating in school activities like sports, force teachers to out students, and censor any in-school discussions of LGBTQ people and issues. Instead of limiting resources, education opportunities, our schools should protect and support all students to learn and thrive. right? And there are other anti-LGBTQ bills. Examples include bans on marriage and bills preempting local non-discrimination protections, right? Those bills fall under other as far as these categories are concerned, right? So we have over 435 such bills proposed at present in the United States being considered. And some of them are passing. But again, this is a very useful resource to track what's going on, to track these developments. And to bring it back to our point, is that a lot of the most damaging legislation and a lot of the creep towards the Sunday law, the creep towards the Sunday law that you're able to track is happening at the state level with bills like this, right? There are flashpoints like Roe v. Wade, but all this is going on just a level below, and it's having real impact on the lives of people on the ground, lives of people who are being targeted by these bills when they pass. And all this is working to, yes?
Sorry, I was just going to highlight, you used the word a moment back in terms of violence. And I think in a sense, that's the well, I won't say hidden thing, but all of these bullet points that you've got here feed fear, and they're sending messages, and it's at the local level, like it's at a school board meeting, or it's at a whatever, different things in a library, or whatever it is, where people are able to put forth some ideas. And yes, it is a narrative on the conservative side. It's an agenda in a sense being fed at every level, multifaceted approach, like the Blitz that you were talking about in reference to the Dominionists. And it eventually, it's like that slow drip, drip, drip. It permeates through society. And so it does get to a place where just walking along a street or riding on rapid transit or on a bus in a transit system or whatever it happens to be, people who are transgender or people who are homosexual, even gay or lesbian, or where it maybe can be a little more evident, whether the way they dress or how they sound or just a look that they have to them or whatever, that other people identify them, oh, that's got to be a gay person or a transgender person. And violence is directed towards that person. So I think we really are at a place where it's starting to tip very definitely in that direction. We'll hear more and more of this crime or that crime perpetrated wherever it happens to be, whatever state or, in Canada. And it bottom lines out on, this was a transgender person that was attacked. And so all of these points are cumulatively, as you mentioned, contributing to this whole toxicity in society that is at any point going to erupt in violence. It might be violence directed against one person, but it's going to increase, and it's going to be everywhere. So I just wanted to highlight the violence because you used that word well.
And yes, certainly, right? Because and if you look at organizations that track hate crimes, what is happening is the number of hate crimes against LGBTQ people, and particularly trans people, are increasing. And it is not hard to see the connection between the increase in hate crimes with the increasingly toxic social climate that is being created for these people by the rhetoric in the culture wars, right? By the things politicians are saying and the narratives being put out, right? And violence and hate crimes, yes, are increasing, but something that is not seen, which is actually, arguably the most damaging to the most lives, right? Affecting the quality of life for most people, is when you have this climate where hatred and bigotry towards you, if I'm a trans person, where hatred and bigotry towards me is normalized, right? And it becomes more general within society. The amount of bigotry, mistreatment, abuse, unfairness that you then encounter day to day in just living your life from day to day, right? That can be very, very crushing to a human being, right? And it's not violence that will make the news, but those daily experiences, right? Those can be, really soul destroying, can just really grind you down and make you feel you have no place in the world. And that is the climate that is becoming more and more prevalent. Right. So I want to take time to talk about abortion rights. And I want to highlight key pieces of legislation, I guess very recent developments. Some from just a couple of days ago. So when it comes to abortion rights, the Arkansas legislature on, I think it was Wednesday, this last week. Yes, Wednesday. They rejected a bill that would have created an exception to their state's abortion ban. So they have an abortion ban, and they created a bill which they rejected a bill that would have created an exception to their abortion ban for incest victims and children who have been raped, right? So the state passes an abortion ban. They have an abortion ban in Arkansas, and a bill is proposed saying, let's exempt incest victims and children who've been raped from this ban. So if you've been raped as a minor, as a child, or if you've been, if your rape was incestuous, you should be able to get an abortion, notwithstanding the ban for everyone else. Arkansas rejected that. They rejected an exception for raped children. So the Democratic Representative Ashley Hudson noted that legislators have spent, quote, an awful lot of time this session talking about things that kids aren't ready to do, from the books they're too young to read to activities they're too young to be exposed to. Yet somehow, when they talk about a situation in which a 10-year-old child is being forced to carry a pregnancy to term that may kill her, the concern for children suddenly evaporates. So in response to that, a Republican representative, Cindy Crawford, said she hadn't seen any evidence that pregnant children suffer negative health consequences. She was quoted as saying, quote, "Would you not agree that two wrongs don't make a right? that the child, that her mental health would be worse after she experienced an abortion than it would be to be able to, with help, with support, give birth to the child and place the baby for adoption. And reading that, there's just so much to unpack. There's just so much to unpack in that development. And I think I guess the first point is the complete negation and rejection of evidence in the face of ideological considerations, right? There's a right-wing ideological perspective about abortion, right? But the evidence, if you're willing to look at it, the evidence that is not produced by these data mills that have been created by right-wing political actors to mill out statistics to counter the actual, factual, legitimate data. The evidence points to how abortion is a medical procedure, how beneficial and protective it is for women, and the evidence which shows how child pregnancies can be dangerous, even fatal, to the child in question. They reject all of that and says, well, I see, what did she say? I see no evidence. She hadn't seen any evidence that pregnant children suffer negative health consequences. Right? From my vantage point, that is a complete negation of evidence, of realities on the ground, of data, in the face of forwarding an ideological agenda at all costs, at all hazards, right? So there's that point. And then there's the point of, right, to sort of sanitize the harms done by their abortion bans when they present them, by forcing women who don't want to carry children, who are unprepared to carry children, by forcing them to carry those children to term. When they're presented with the evidence of the harm that these things do, they try to sanitize it or really make themselves, present themselves as having virtuous motives by saying, no, the children, we want them taken care of with support. Rather let that child live and let the child be put up for adoption, right? But the very same conservative politicians are not proposing legislation, are not proposing additional funding to the adoption systems in these various states, which are very often in complete disarray. There's so much abuse happening in them. Sorry, there is abuse, there is mismanagement, and there's so much wrong, right? They're underfunded, chronically underfunded, but there's said support to the adoption agencies, the adoption things. They're not providing additional supports in that direction, which really betrays what it's really about, right? It's really not about the children. The children are pretext, right? Okay. In North Carolina, this last week as well. No, sorry. Arkansas, this was actually 31st. Arkansas was yesterday. North Carolina was March 29th, which was this last Wednesday, right? So in North Carolina, this last Wednesday, one of the Republican sponsors, someone's in, let me let them in. Last Wednesday, one of the Republican sponsors of the newly introduced abortion ban, Representative Keith Kidwell, said the legislation didn't have a rape or incest exception because, quote, we don't kill a child because of what the father or mother did, end quote. And when asked by reporters if he was worried that women's health would be at risk if they couldn't get care in the state, Kidwell responded, a woman who wants to get an abortion today is going to do that. He then said that if women really need an abortion, they can just go to New York or California. Right. And again, you know, that betrays because who are the ones who are going to be impacted the most by these abortion bans? It's poor women, right? It's not all women that are impacted to the same extent. It's poor women, because if you're poor, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, which is the majority of the American populace at this point, you can't afford to just take off to New York or California to receive an abortion. So the rich, right, you know, there's that intersectionality where we're seeing, you know, that it is poor women in particular who are suffering the brunt of these abortion bans, right? To say, well, it's banned in North Carolina, and if you really want one, just, you know, fly off to Cali. It's anyway. At a press conference the following day, March 30th, Kidwell told reporters this bill was his third attempt to see a pro-life bill pass through the General Assembly. He said each year he's been elected, he has filed similar legislation. He is more confident the Human Life Protection Act will pass because Republicans have the majority vote. So that's something to keep an eye on. Going to talk about Idaho. Another Idaho hospital has shut down its maternity ward just weeks after Bonner General Health closed their labor and delivery unit because of the state's abortion ban. Valor Health Hospital in Emmett announced their closure this week, citing multiple factors, including staff shortages. Nearly half of the OBGYNs in Idaho are leaving the state or considering leaving over the abortion ban. So these abortion bans are having ripple effects to where it's not simply access to abortion that's being affected. The professionals, the doctors and OBGYNs who are being criminalized by these abortion bans, they naturally are not planning on sticking around, they're leaving, which is going to create creating shortages, right? Or making it harder for women to access healthcare, to access an OBGYN. So these are some of the ripple effects. Doctors in the state have been raising the alarm about the danger of the law, including Republicans' latest attempt to clarify the ban, which is more about PR than actually helping women. The bill redefines abortion as not including treatment for an ectopic pregnancy or a miscarriage where the fetus has died in utero. There is no exemption for miscarriages where the fetal heartbeat is still present, and Republicans rejected language that would have added an exception for, quote, life-threatening conditions as too broad. Republican Representative Julianne Young said, the list was endless when we began considering the decisions that would fall under that language. Also in Idaho, the abortion trafficking bill passed the legislature yesterday and is expected to be signed by anti-choice Governor Brad Little. The law would not only make it a crime punishable by 2 to 5 years in prison to take a minor out of state for an abortion, but would criminalize in-state travel for abortion care as well, like picking up abortion medication at the post office. If a local prosecutor declines to go after an abortion trafficking case, the legislation also gives the state attorney general the power to prosecute people who they say violated the law. So when you look at this law that's about to be signed, that was passed and is about to be signed, it makes it a crime to, okay, so you're saying in Idaho, abortion is legal. It's criminalizing you if you travel out of state, travel to another state where abortion is legal to obtain that abortion. So this is a legal Pandora's box, right? That how can someone be prosecuted in one state, the state that they reside in, for obtaining services in another state where that thing is legal, right? It's raising all manner of questions about, the limits of, the limits of states' rights and so on and so forth. And naturally, it's being challenged in the courts, right? But what it is doing is that it is creating a chilling effect. Naturally, it's creating a situation where a lot of doctors, because they don't know what's, it's not clear what's legal or what isn't, or whether they'll be prosecuted or not, are just choosing not to get involved, not to perform the procedure, right? It's creating a chilling effect, right? Even though it's being challenged in the courts. In an op-ed about the same Supreme Court decision allowing life-saving abortions, an Oklahoma law professor tells us about some of the horror stories doctors in the state have seen since Roe was overturned. One physician says they had to leave a patient nearly septic because the hospital's ethics board didn't want them to act while the fetus still had a heartbeat. I listened to a radio program about this. It's a horrific story. The woman basically, the fetus was not viable, right? And she needed an abortion. But as long as the fetus had a heartbeat, the doctors, the ethics board, in the wake of the striking down rate, they did not want to perform that abortion. And she had to basically come to the doors of death before they could act to save her life by performing the abortion. She had to sit at home and literally wait until she got bad enough, close enough to death before they could do anything. And it was very, but these are the things happening. So another doctor, Dr. Dana Stone, relayed having to deny care to a woman whose water broke too early for the pregnancy to be viable. The woman survived, but Dr. Stone says this is just torture for the patient, and it is torture for the doctors as well. And stories like this, she said, are not rare. So we've spoken about Arkansas, North Carolina, Idaho, and Oklahoma. Okay, so we're approaching an hour and a half, but I just have a few more points to make. Then we'll wrap up and then we'll wrap up and close.
Thibault, may I just interject on the point you just were making, because there are a lot of cases materializing like what you just described I remember a case, another young woman, and on the point of death, really, but her husband was able to get her across the border where an abortion was able to be performed, you know, in the nick of time. But two things in many ways are being underestimated in some of these discussions and as various bills are being put forward. And that is the emotional toll, like emotional health, as well as mental health. And it just sort of throughout our society and throughout the medical system, still to this day, it's highlighting how mental health is not, well, mental health and emotional health are not held in the same, to the same degree of import as, I'll just say, physical health. And this whole situation with abortion, like the toll on the woman, you know, in terms of choosing to have an abortion, like that's a very weighty decision to make. Or the toll, the emotional toll, you know, some of these women that are carrying unviable fetuses in the situation that I was describing, the baby had already died, or I shouldn't say the baby, the fetus had already died in utero. So she was carrying a dead fetus inside her, and still they would not allow an abortion. I mean, incredible cases. And the other point I'd like to make, coming back a little bit to what you were describing in terms of raped children and in cases of incest and no exemptions being made. In some degrees, there's a real irony here, because many times the raping of underage children, boy or girl, obviously the latter can end up in a pregnancy, but the raping of underage children or incestuous rape often occurs in conservative religious communities. That is more where the preponderance of some of these situations exists. And it's so ironic, you know, the one quote you were bringing to justify, you know, that there's no harm done, two wrongs don't make a right. Well, how holier than thou, self-righteous that attitude is, because in many cases, you know, a lot of these situations that arise are within religious communities. It can be Catholic, it can be Mormon, it can be whatever, you know, conservative religious community where a lot of these crimes are occurring, and the damage to the children and what they bear for the remainder of their life, whether they give birth or not. You know, I mean, a father raping a daughter continuously over years, you know, some of these situations, and they're a lot more prevalent than what society would like to admit to, and certainly what any Christian or any religious groups would want to admit to. So there is an irony in this no abortion under any circumstance attitude, and just the harm, the absolute harm. People without means, you know, the poor women, as you mentioned, and a lot of other different contexts. It's just, it's almost diabolical, you know, and in fact, actually, I'll just say it is diabolical.
Yes, and It certainly is. You know, someone was making the point that if you look at, if you're going to address, if you're going to prioritize issues to address in terms of their magnitude, in terms of what we know about them, trans people grooming children is not an issue. It's not something that is happening on any scale which constitutes a societal problem. On the inverse, sexual abuse in churches and in church settings, you know, if you're going to prioritize, you know, what the bigger issue is, identifiable by the information that we have, you'd be targeting the churches, right? To hold them accountable and to clean up and to get their act together on that front, right? So it's interesting. It's interesting. Okay, so we're almost out of time, so I'll just wrap up. One of the fastest growing anti-trans strategies, this is interesting, and it goes to the issue of what's happening at lower levels of government versus at the federal level. One of the fastest growing anti-choice strategies is banning abortion via local ordinances in pro-choice states. So you have states passing abortion bans, right? And they're doing that. Then you have pro-choice states which at the state level, abortion is legal. But then you have conservative districts, conservative counties passing local ordinances in pro-choice states, local ordinances that are in effect abortion bans or prevent service providers that provide abortion from setting up shop in their counties or districts or whatever. Says we've seen this in Nebraska and New Mexico. Today, the New Mexico Supreme Court granted the Attorney General's request to block those ordinances while the issue is battled out in court. New Mexico also recently passed legislation to stop local governments from restricting abortion despite state law. Right, so yeah, New Mexico and Nebraska. Yeah, the laws in New Mexico and Nebraska, they were designed to prevent abortion providers from moving into the towns which were presenting these local ordinances. So that's being battled out in court right now as we speak, but it's definitely something to observe in the strategies that we're seeing being employed. Last point, North Dakota classrooms will be required to show a 3-minute long high-definition ultrasound video to students in an attempt to dissuade them from having abortion. So North Dakota schools are being made to show children videos of ultrasounds to try to dissuade them. And but remember, the vast majority of abortions are happening early in a pregnancy, right? It happen very early in a pregnancy. And a point was made to share a picture of what a 6-week pregnancy looks like, right? Because usually when they show you pictures of an ultrasound, they're showing you, much farther along in the pregnancy. Most abortions are not happening at that stage, but it's being done really as a propaganda tool, right? And I'll just share my screen as to what a 6-week pregnancy looks like. Let me just it would be more appropriate for them if they were being honest to the reality of when abortions are taking place, to show of when most abortions are happening, to show pictures, round about this stage and maybe a little later. But it's definitely not the child that you're seeing in an ultrasound, right? So I'll stop that share. Okay, so to round off, we've been looking at, the idea has been to look at the agitation of the Sunday law. We're seeing the issues that constitute the Sunday law. We're seeing them being agitated now. They're being agitated in the culture wars, in social, cultural, in political discourse. And we're seeing the battle playing out in legislation that is being proposed. That is being proposed by various actors. And that march to the Sunday law, it's a buildup. It's a buildup that we must track, that we must recognize and see its progression, right? Right, to the state of things where we have entrenched patriarchal oppression, right? And we made the point that a lot of this, you have to know what you're looking for, and you have to track it. You have to be paying attention, basically, because a lot of it is not happening at the national level. A lot of it's happening at the state level, as we've observed. A lot of this creep towards the Sunday law can be tracked at the state level. So we looked at anti-LGBTQ legislation, which there's 435 bills across the United States right now, covering various areas of anti-LGBTQ legislation. And we spoke briefly about some latest developments in the area of abortion rights and some of the latest strategies being used to limit women's access to this important procedure. So that brings us to the end of the study. I'll invite, are there any questions or comments before we close?
Overall, why are these conservatives fighting for these bills to be passed? Do they care about the result of the bills, or do they just care about their own power in their political party? Or what's the big push behind it all?
It does get baffling sometimes when you think, especially when you're familiar with the evidence of how harmful what they're doing is, and how you almost have to be intentional in avoiding the evidence which points out how harmful what they're doing is, but yet they go ahead with it anyway. It can get perplexing to sort of think, why are you doing this? But I guess there are a range of reasons why they're doing it. And I think one prominent one is the worldview, which sees that, yes, so sound like someone was about to say something. No? The worldview, which sees that, the country, society, was built by men, specifically white men, and it should be run by white men, and that women have their place in society and their sphere, and that sphere is below that of men, and people from racial minorities also have their sphere, and that sphere is below those men as well, right? And the movements that have been happening towards promoting equality, civil rights movement, the feminist movement, which have been leveling the playing field and have been important towards, leading towards a society where people are more equal and just viewed as human beings, right? that necessarily translates into a loss of power for them. So they're eager to maintain this patriarchal, hierarchical status quo, right? They're eager to maintain it. They're eager to roll back the progress towards equality and to, entrench a social order where they are at the top and are able to exploit freely by virtue of being the ones in power, and where other people are kept in their place by oppression if necessary, if they get too uppity, right? So there's the issue of worldview, right? Worldview, the fear of the loss of power. There are many reasons why. It's a good question. And I suppose it's a question that we could be discussing. There's the religious element. We know why, the religious element, they're motivated by the ideas about the Bible, and their patriarchy is coming from that angle, right? Yeah. So that's my. Jonathan says, I think the right-wing politicians are often only catering to their base. It's like the story of Jimmy Savile. Society was to blame. Some of the conservative politicians had skeletons in their closets of hidden abortions and abuses that contradict their political mantra. They do it for their base, to get elected. Ultimately, society is responsible for the push for the laws. And that is absolutely true, right? There's an element to which, the politicians are pandering to an element that is already present in the society. Trump did not create the racism and misogyny that exploded, when he entered politics. He played to it. It was already there. It was already latent within society. He made that element feel. He made that element feel it was okay for them to express themselves, to express those aspects of their thinking and feeling. So that's absolutely true, that ultimately society, it's people who, they're pandering to people who ultimately support, the worldview that is promoted through it. But a lot of people don't too, which is why they have to pass laws limiting people's right to vote, for example, which is why they have to gerrymander. They have to entrench minority rule, because a lot of what they're imposing, a lot of people, as a matter of fact, the majority actually don't support it. Most Americans support access to abortion. A lot of these laws are being imposed against the will of the majority. So yeah, there's all of that going on. I'll propose that we close, and then we can continue discussion. We can continue discussion afterwards. Let's close the word of prayer. Lord in heaven, we thank you for the blessed hours of the Sabbath. We thank you for the light that you've given us on this, the dispensation that we're in. We thank you for the knowledge that we are approaching the Sunday law, and that we're in the agitation of the Sunday law. Teach us all the way, Lord, how to be your lights in this world, how we may stand as your representatives in our respective spheres of activity and action, how this light that you've committed to us may be a blessing, or can be a blessing, or how we may make it a blessing to those around us. Please bless us, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
I think the whole thing is quite